Today we'll be going through the pelvis and a couple different exercises that can give very different outcomes in terms of what the pelvis is doing. So the best way to visualize the pelvis itself is to compare it to our scapula and our humerus. As our arm moves above our head, our scapula moves up as well with it. So this can be compared very similarly to the pelvis itself.
So before we get into the exercises as to what are going to work best for the pelvis to get two different outcomes, as Josh was mentioning before, what we're going to run through is just the basic pelvic anatomy. So as we can see here through this pelvic model, we've got sort of the center of the pelvis here being the pubic symphysis. We've got the two innominate bones on either side with our sacrum and lumbar in the middle there. These two here are the femurs. So what we can see through the back here, just for reference as well, is we've got our PSIS as well, just for reference. Basically, I guess the two movements that are going to be really important to note are going to be what's called counter nutation and mutation. Now, these two positions that the pelvis and the sacrum go into are going to be really important in helping us do movements such as our deadlift and our squat, and being able to produce power when we are doing these exercises as well. So if you ever feel like, I guess, you're losing the ability to push down through the floor, it's probably because you're not in the right position of the pelvis to be able to do so. So the first movement that we're going to break down is what's called mutation. So mutation is, I guess, a really nice position when we are looking to bias more of a flexed lumbar spine. And what will basically happen is both of these innominate bones here on either side will more or less, to the degrees of the range of movement they have, adduct or internally rotate, along with the sacrum here opening up and tipping forward. So what that will look like essentially from this backwards view is that as these innominate bones internally rotate or adduct, you'll find that this sacrum here will essentially tip forward, giving us more of a flexed lumbar spine position in this mutated position of the pelvis. And I guess from the bottom view of the pelvis here, what you'll find is that as these innominate bones again adduct, the sacrum will tip backwards towards where your back pockets would be on your jeans, for example, opening up that hole through the bottom of the pelvis. If we look at the inverse movement here of counter nutation, what you'll find is that instead of everything opening up at the bottom or the innominate bones adducting, internally rotating, we'll find that they actually externally rotate and create more space at the top of the pelvis here, while allowing that sort of sacrum there to sort of tuck under more towards the belt buckle. So I guess from the back here, what we'll find is that as these innominate bones adduct and externally rotate, we'll find that this sacrum will tip forward towards that belt buckle again, creating a strong position to push through the floor.
So like Chris was saying, we have our two pelvic positions being more of a nutated position, like so, where everything's opening, and more of a counter-nutated position, where everything's closing at the bottom. Each of these positions do have a benefit to the squat and the deadlift, and that's what we're going to be going through now, in the ways that we can try and train these positions to be more effective with some accessories. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between hinging with a good morning, or hinging very far backwards, and hinging with an RDL, or more hinging forwards over the front of your toes. So we're going to start with the good morning. So one of the things we find the good morning very, very good at is teaching the ability to create that mutation or that space for hip flexion. So if you're one of those lifters that feels very, very strong, finds it's easy to push with your legs, but you constantly struggle with hitting depth, then this is going to be for you. So when we perform the good morning, what we want to imagine that we're doing is we're trying to sit our hips backwards as far as we can whilst maintaining some form of lumbar extension. So this lumbar extension is just going to ensure that we're not flexing our lower back and we're actually hinging at our hips. But the big shift back of our hips onto our heels, trying to send them back as far as we can, is what's going to allow the backside or the bottom underside of this pelvis to open up. So the further that we sit backwards, the more this is going to open and expand and allow those pelvic innominates, like Chris was saying, to adduct, open up, and come around and make it easier for the femur to actually come into hip flexion. It's going to give you a lot more space to get down lower into the squat. So the big thing that we're going for here is with the pelvic movements, it can be quite difficult to actually see what our sacrum is doing. There's a lot of muscle mass around there, like the glutes, and it's a very small amount of movement that actually occurs at the SIJ. So one of the cheats, one of the tricks that we can use is we can look at what our thoracic spine is doing. Our thoracic spine and our sacrum have a bit of a relationship in regards to the fact that whatever one is doing, the other is going to be doing the same. And this even extends a little bit to what the cervical spine and lumbar spine does. But what we can imagine we're doing is if we're sitting back in our hips as far as possible, we're really trying to get into that full good morning position, our thoracic spine will actually start to extend. Partly just due to where our center of mass is to stop us from falling over backwards. But when that thoracic spine starts to extend like so and really sort of arch up, not necessarily through a rib flare, but like the thoracic spine getting longer and even like taller, we'll start to see that sacrum go into that slight tipping forward position, that more nutated position that's going to be opening up the back of the hips. And then that's going to be one of the signs we can look for that we're actually getting into that position now. The big benefit of this with a squat is our pelvic floor at the very bottom of this, like so, almost acts like a trampoline. So if you've ever seen those people that kind of hit the bottom of a squat and feel like they just bounce straight out, they're able to do this really well. Because whenever we drop down into a squat, a lot of our organs sort of pick up a bit of inertia or momentum, and they'll move with us. And if we can open up the bottom of that pelvis like so, we almost get like a little bit of a trampoline effect. And all those organs bounce off the bottom in that really kind of open position where like it's a trampoline being stretched in that pelvic floor. And then we're able to then close it and launch ourselves back up, moving into more of the counter-rotated position. So the next bit we're going to talk about is more of the RDL, or the accessory to train counter nutation. So this is very good for those who feel like squat depth is super easy. You can just sink into a squat with no issues whatsoever. But you find the knees are very heavily caving in to try and launch you out, or you just don't feel like it's very easy to actually push with your legs. You feel like your legs don't feel like they're under you, they don't have a lot of strength. It's just quite hard to generally feel strong under a barbell, especially for deadlifts. So what we're going to do with the RDL is, rather than sitting backwards really far in the good morning, is we're actually going to be hinging forwards over our toes. So like Chris was saying earlier, the counter nutation position looks much more like this, much more like a closing off of the pelvis, where the actual pelvic innominate are going to be abducting away from the spine at the top there. So the big thing that this is going to do is this is going to start to push each of those innominates into a position of extension. As soon as they start to close off and tip forward, it's going to be a lot easier for our femurs to start to produce some more hip extension, and even easier for them to actually get into those further ranges of hip extension. So one of the ways I like to visualize this as something like an octopus or a squid swimming in the water. So whenever the tentacles kind of close off and squish, that octopus gets launched forward in the water, and that's very similar to what's happening with the pelvis here. So if we can get down to the bottom of the squat, where it's really nice and open up, then we just need to teach the body or the pelvis how to close off. And that's also going to extend into that kind of launching of the trampoline I was talking about earlier, where we can get a lot of that just momentum and inertia to then launch ourselves back up. So coming back to the RDL, one of the big things we want to look for is we actually want to try and stiffen up the pelvis as much as we can. Because the more we can try and put ourselves in a position of just this counter nutation, like so, the easier we're going to find movements like deadlifts especially. So one of the hardest things about a deadlift is that there's no eccentric before the concentric. So we have to make sure that we're in the most stiff power producing position we can, so it's very easy to break the ground without feeling like we're getting heavy knee cave, excessive lumbar rounding, etc., etc. So with the RDL, where we're really trying to hinge forward, the more we can try and lean over our toes, try and headbutt the wall in front of us, the more we're going to find that this pelvis can actually achieve this more closed off counter nutation position. And if we can practice that and get better at that, we're going to find we can start our deadlift in a position like this, where we can just push through the ground and just immediately go into that force production position, as opposed to something like a squat where we need to open and then close. So similarly to the good morning, we can also look at the thoracic spine in this instance. So when we're hinging forward really, really far over our toes, we should actually start to see our thoracic go into a little bit of flexion or get a little bit of ribcage retraction. So this shouldn't look like excessive abdominal contraction or really like rounding, but should just likely start to get a little bit of a hunchback in our upper back. And like the more that we start to hinge forward over the toes, the more that upper back goes into flexion, the more that lower back starts to move into extension. And that's just those QL muscles pulling our innominates into more of an anteriorly tilted position like so. So kind of knowing these two accessories and the ways that they're going to have effects on our body, we can start to program this so we can start to make the lift we struggle with or the movement pattern we struggle with far easier, and start to develop that inability to move well in that position.